as I said, we are NWSOFA, Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. We're one of 6,700 indivisible chapters across the country. We have the twin snowflake principle we're organized on. The left side is communications. The right side are all of our issue teams. We started about 12, 13 years ago, trying to figure out 17 of us that were calling for Barack Obama in his second term. Well, after he won, we said, "What should we do?" We said, "Well, let's start a group, a progressive group." Fortunately or unfortunately for us, shortly thereafter, Sandy Hook happened, and so at the very top of that issues team in the blue, you'll see gun violence prevention. That is our oldest group, and it has continued to have monthly meetings, organizing, putting stamps on doors, no guns allowed, doing all kinds of things and keeping up the Illinois and the national gun issues. We then added in order healthcare reform with Obamacare, immigration reform, social justice, stand with women on women's issues, etc. And there's a big question out there whether the ERA now has been approved or not. And of course, we have the fiscal and economic group continuing around that circle. We've added 4 years ago when we joined Indivisible election outreach, federal, state, and local. This coming Tuesday, a week from this Tuesday, tomorrow or tonight, we'll have a climate change meeting. And this coming Monday, we'll have a ROD group, our Restore Our Democracy group, doing a special presentation, Trump's promises versus his oligarchy. And that should really be interesting. So the ROD group has two basic areas, one that deals on voting rights, elections, gerrymandering, vote by mail, and the other which is confronting disinformation and the issues of the day. To keep this organization going, today we have 5,800 members. We have 24 all-volunteer folks that manage these different groups and the communications group. And of interest, since the advent of Zoom, about 1,000 of these members now are outside of Illinois. And I think we typically get 4 or 5 people who are in other countries to join us. So that is the encapsulation of NWSOFA, Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. And tonight, our fiscal and economic co-leads, Carl Falstash and Dave Donnie, will lead us through the December information and what they see ahead. So let me turn it over to David and Carl.
Welcome, everyone. Glad you could make it tonight. This is the January meeting of the Fiscal and Economic Issues Group of NWSOFA. We try to provide you with facts of what's really happening, so you can use these to sharpen your arguments and communicate to your audience whatever that is, whether you're responding to a Facebook post, responding to comments on an article in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Economist. Anywho, first issue is we're going to go over labor issues, which is labor and employment, which are really the biggest items in terms of economic metrics. Going up to the fourth slide, we are currently looking at 7 million more jobs that have been added since the pre-pandemic level. 16.6 million have been added since Biden took office. And this is through December. Biden's data really runs from February through January. So we have one more month of data for Biden before unemployment data before his presidency will be complete, because the months are done based on the week containing the 12th of the month. Now, the 12th of January was a Sunday, so it was the week of January 12th through 18th, but that was all complete before Trump took office yesterday on the 20th. Among other things, President Biden had the lowest unemployment rate on average among the last 14 presidents. the highest hourly wages, real hourly wages, and nominal as well, among the last presidents. The net worth, Americans are the richest ever, or were the richest ever in 2022. That data tends to lag a bit, so we probably won't have the 2024 data on Biden for another couple of years. More people got health insurance under Biden. We've got the Infrastructure Act with 66,000 projects underway. We did the Inflation Reduction Act, which means that Medicare can negotiate drug prices. Also, Medicare out-of-pocket costs were capped at $2,000 per year for drugs that are part of the Part D program, Medicare program. And I don't know. I know that Trump issued things canceling those items, so I don't know if that's one of the ones that got canceled or not. We also say that if Trump did nothing, the immigration surge would add significantly to GDP going forward while reducing deficits. But again, we're fairly certain that Trump will change what's happening with immigration. Now, again, employment data for Biden runs through January 2025, and then the first cut of January employment data will be on the first Friday in February, which is the 7th. But then those numbers get revised. So it'll be a while before we'll get the final numbers for January. Real GDP data for Biden actually runs through the first quarter of 2025, and we'll get the first cut of first quarter real GDP in April, and the third cut or final revision at the end of June of 2025. Now, one of the things that makes life interesting is that real wage data in 2020 was skewed because over 20 million people lost their jobs early in the pandemic, February, March, April. And what that did was that by taking out a lot of low wage workers out of the averages, we artificially grew the average wages during those months. And then as the low wage workers came back in, average wages tended to go down a little bit, both under Trump and then under Biden when he took office. Also, budget years, deficits, things like that, run from October to September. So we're currently in fiscal year 2025 or budget year 2025, and Trump is not taking office until almost 4 years into fiscal year 2025. So this will be a Biden year, and Trump budget years will start again in fiscal year 2026. He may have an impact on what happens with fiscal year 2025 budget results once he takes over. Various organizations think that his actions may add to deficits depending upon what he actually does in terms of tariffs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, jobs, slide 6. The jobs report is, as we talked about, perhaps the most important economic news. And the number of jobs added or lost helps us tell us the strength of the economy, direction of the economy. And it's one of the main things that the National Bureau of Economic Research uses when they decide whether or not we're in a recession. And we haven't been in a recession except briefly in 2020. Again, we lost those over 20 million jobs inside of a couple of months. Now, adding about 100 to 150,000 jobs is a pretty good steady as she goes economy. Over 150 is a kind of robust job growth. We currently have about 160 million payroll jobs, which is what we normally talk about in terms of jobs. Those do not include 1099 workers, your Lyft and Grubhub drivers who are not on anybody's payroll, but they get their income from 1099. So the jobs figures are based upon a giant survey of employers, and the final jobs numbers are based upon unemployment returns filed by those employers. But those don't come in until sometime like next year for the current month. So how are we doing on jobs? Well, we had a pretty good month in December. After slowing down earlier in the year, we added 256,000 jobs in December, had some plus and minus adjustments to prior months. total net negative of 8,000 months jobs taken out of those 2 months means that job creation has averaged about 354,000 per month under Biden. And we, as this graph shows, we hit the pre-pandemic peak in June of 2022. And so we've averaged about 240,000 jobs a month since July of 2022. So we've had dang good job growth under Biden, period. Now, as you see the final note there, these figures exclude the preliminary benchmark revision of 816,000 jobs. So we will expect to see them revised down. It'll still be pretty impressive job. Now, if we look at the job growth over the last 3 month averages, we see that job growth has been coming down, but we're still kind of above the break even numbers. And so we expect to see, hopefully, when President Trump took over in 2017, job growth went down a little bit, but we continue to have pretty healthy job growth for his first 3 years in office. Never quite equaling what we were seeing at the end of the Obama presidency, but still pretty good until 2020. And then we had a total negative under Trump, and we'll see this in this next slide. Trump pre-pandemic, you know, Obama, okay, we jumped on us. We're one slide ahead of where we want to be. Want that bar chart back, okay? And all right, I got to see what's going on with my computer versus anyhow. If we look at the bars for average by president, we see Obama's averaged in his second term 216,000 jobs per month. Trump pre-pandemic averaged 180,000, but including his full 4 years, we averaged a negative 57,000 a month, or a total loss of over 2 million jobs over the course of his 4 years. And then we see that Biden, since he took over, has had dang good job growth. Even if we adjust them down by what we expect to see an 818,000 revision, we're still going to see 240,000 jobs per month, 212,000, which is better than what we were seeing under Trump, and about equal to Biden's second term. Okay, now unemployment rate has been good under Biden. If you remember, when Trump took office, the unemployment rate was 4.7%. It went down, but then when he left office, it was at 6.4%. So when Biden took office, the unemployment rate was at 6.4%. In this most recent month of data, it's at 4.1%. We'll see where it finally ends up when we get the January data next month, and then the revisions to it later on. Anyhow, Tulsa, it's a percent of the labor force that's not working. It's a measure of slack in the economy. Historical average is about 5.7% for data back to 1948. Biden's average 4%, which is the lowest of the last 14 presidents. And it's based upon a survey of about 60,000 households a month. And if we look at it graphically, we see that the unemployment rate was low, reached a low of 3.5% under Trump, peaked at 14.8% in April of 2020, was back down to 6.4%, got down to 3.4% under Biden, and is now back up to 4.1%, which is still pretty darn good and better than a lot of historical averages. Looking at the averages by year, we again that the average for Trump's first 3 years was 4.0%. Again, he started at 4.7, but then 2020, the average unemployment rate was 8.1%. And so we ended up with Biden's first year average 5.4%, then 3.6, 3.6, 4.0. And if we look at the comparisons by president, we see that Biden's average of 4.1% is the lowest of any president since we started recording these numbers under Truman. And this shows that the unemployment rates improved under Biden because there were not quite sure what the red indicates on this.
Red is over 7% and less than 20%.
Okay.
Red is bad. Let's put it that way.
I didn't realize at the end of the Trump administration, we had quite so much of the country that was over 7%. But I guess given that the average was 6.4%, I should not be that surprised. We probably were over 7% here in Illinois, certainly up in the Chicago area. Anywho, look at the unemployment rate by race. We see that, well, it's currently 4.1% under Biden. That's not true for everyone. Blacks at 6.5%, Latinos 5.1%, whites are a little better at 3.7%, and Asians are a little better at 3.5%. All those numbers were a little higher under Trump overall. I don't know, David, if you want to have any other comments about this graphic.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at I think a more fair comparison is that second pair of numbers. So the Trump before the pandemic and then Biden after the pandemic. So you sort of take out 2020 and 2021 for the most part. You can still see Biden comes out ahead. And when you look at educational attainment, sort of why would blacks be higher than whites? Why would Latinos be higher than whites? Some of it is the educational attainment. If you look at Latino, white, and Asian, the unemployment rate is falling on that for the averages for those three groups as educational attainment goes up. But it's not the case for African American or Black, as the BLS refers to the group. Still, 28% is higher than 21%, but the unemployment rate is actually higher. So there may be some things in whether it's high school achievement or others that we'll have to dig into. But you can kind of look at it as the more educated the population, the more educated groups tend to have lower unemployment. Holds true for the Latino, white, and Asians, but not so much for Black, which is sort of an outlier with higher educational attainment, but also higher unemployment than, say, the Latino group. So we'll have to look at some of the other elements. It's not just based on education. There are other factors at play. But at least you can kind of see giving Trump the benefit of the doubt, just treating him pre-pandemic, when sort of his best 3 years, and Biden's post-pandemic, Biden still comes out ahead. So on jobs and unemployment, two absolutely critical measures of the economy, Biden's better.
Okay. We look at the level of unemployment, and we see that when Biden took over, we had 10 million people unemployed. We got that down to 5.7 million. But then in the last 2 years, it's gone up a little bit, up about 1.2 million from the low point in January of 2023, which was about 2 years ago. Okay, and I'll let David take a stab at what this explains that, but it's basically based on the household survey that gets us to the unemployment numbers.
Right. If you want to understand how that unemployment number is computed, that there's the number that are unemployed and the number employed. Unemployed means there's no job. The person, this is when they're surveyed or their family is called. They say, I don't have a job. I was looking, though, in the last 4 weeks, and I'm available to work. They will call you unemployed. If you were to say, I'm not looking for a job, you would not be in the labor force. You would be in this bucket over here. And so the employed and the unemployed is what we call the labor force. And the unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. That's where these numbers come from. And each of these two numbers add up. The civilian labor force and the non-labor force add up to the non-institutional population. By non-institutional, that means not in the military, not in jail, and then it's age 16 plus. These numbers all have 3 zeros after them. So this is 269 million people. Unemployed is almost 7 million, as Carl talked about before. One thing I often see people arguing is, yeah, but the labor force participation rate is falling, or the employment to population ratio is falling. That's going to happen with an older population. As the population ages, you're going to have more people in this not in labor force bucket. So you always want to use the 25 to 54 ratios for understanding these. And I see this all the time, people attacking the unemployment numbers, the rate, or attacking the number of jobs, saying, yeah, but the labor force participation is falling. That has been predicted for decades based on our demographics. So don't use these numbers, use the 25 to 54, and we'll share that with you shortly. But if you're curious about where these numbers come from, this shows you where they were in December.
If you were to pull up the labor force participation rate for men only, since we started keeping those statistics, you would find that it has basically been falling since the late 1940s. Combination of a lot of things, some people striking it rich, some people retiring early, getting injured, dropping out of the workforce, whatever. And as the population ages, people dropped out of the workforce and the labor force participation rate has dropped for men. Now, for women, when we passed the Civil Rights Act of 64, which meant we could no longer legally discriminate against women, women's workforce participation rate went from 30% up to, in the early 1960s, up to just over 60% in 2000. And it's been relatively flat since then.
The primary reason men are outside the labor force is usually disability now. And the main reason women are outside the labor force is caregiving. So if you are a stay-at-home parent or caregiver for an elderly relative, and that's what you do, you're not in a job, you're not in the labor force. And if you are retired or in school, that's another reason why you see people here, particularly the retired, as the country ages, this number is increasing relative to the size of the population. And so when you see these ratios where they have that pop for population, we're dividing by this population number, you're always going to see that downward bias by age, which is why, you want to see the age 25 to 54 to see how things are really doing. And we'll share that information with you here shortly.
Okay. And this is the data from the household survey for December. And we see that the population went up, the labor force went up, the participation rate was pretty much unchanged. The number of people unemployed went up a little bit. The employment to population ratio went up slightly. The number of people unemployed actually went down a little bit. So the unemployment rate went down slightly from 4.2 to 4.1%. Actually, a little bit more than that if you look at the numbers to two digits. And then now the labor force dropped a little bit. Again, this is how the numbers get reported and then calculated off of these. And again, this is where we talk about the employment population ratio of prime working age people 25 to 54, which means that we're probably talking about people who are no longer in college and haven't yet retired, for the most part. There's some people that are still in college after age 25, and there's some people that retire before age 54, but by and large, that's what this group tends to hit. And we see that this employment to population ratio just pre-pandemic hit 80.4%, and it's currently at 80.5%. So it's just about where it was pre-pandemic. And the next graph is job openings to the number of people unemployed. And we see that just prior to the pandemic, there were about 1.2 job openings for every person that was unemployed. That went way down early in 2020, then went up to where we were actually in 2022. We were 2 job openings for every person who was unemployed. We're back down to where we're at 1.1 job openings for every person who's unemployed. So it's not a terrible job market. It's just not what it was a couple of years ago, when there were people who were, basically able to, change jobs easily. It's not quite 25 years ago, when in order to get a job you had to be able to spell IT, but it's not a bad job market. And then this is Our conservative friends like to talk about how all the jobs are part-time or government or people holding multiple jobs, and that's why these numbers are off. And so what we see is that 2019's pre-pandemic, 2023, 2024 average, part-time work was just about the same, slightly lower in the more recent period. Government jobs, just about the same, slightly lower in the more recent period. Multiple job holders, just about the same. And layoffs are a little lower currently. And so we see is that no, it's not a question of part-time jobs. Now, if we look at part-time jobs, I haven't looked at it in a while, but there's about 27 million people that are working part-time. And of these, about 5 million of people that are working part-time want a full-time job. The majority of the people that are working part-time actually want to be working part-time. Their parents, semi-retired people, students, etc., that are enjoying the fact that they can find a job and work part-time and not have to be tied down to full-time employment. So let's see if people have questions about the labor market. David, can you?
I'm going through some of the chat now, and just let's see if we've got any themes here or any particular questions we want to tackle.
Okay.
Just bear with me as I flip through this real quick. There's a lot of, you can expect that Trump is going to try to take credit for everything. He may wait a little while, but that's what he does. And I think there's a lot we can learn from him as a marketing person. He's a very good marketer, and he knows how to command the media in what he does. And a lot of these incredible achievements that Biden has, people didn't even know. People don't know that we've got the lowest unemployment rate on average among the last 14 presidents. You would think that every Democratic person would be saying that, but they didn't. And so there's a whole lot of things that we can do with our messaging. So that'll be a theme that we'll be returning to a lot, because you'll watch Trump and he'll give a master class on how to brag about your own economy. He just has to wait a little while because he doesn't want to do it just yet. He's got to put in a few things before he can say everything's fine, which they are. We got some comments about gas prices. That's a big deal to people. We'll talk a little bit later about whenever people talk about prices, I get a little angry because prices are meaningless unless you know what's going on with wages. Yeah, gas is more expensive, but are your wages twice what they were or 50% higher too? I mean, where are the wages relative to that? And we'll show that to you. We'll show you that wages have outgrown inflation for the typical worker. And not only that, but they've outgrown it at the lower boundary. The lower incomes have outgrown the higher incomes. So I think of the inflation, most of the inflation, as a fake media crisis, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Inflation is not a crisis unless it's outgrowing wages, and it just didn't. Yeah, there's a lot of what's Trump doing stuff in here.
Thank you, Christine, for putting a link to the slides so people can pick those up and save them.
That's right. Got a mention of the Illinois black unemployment rate is 8.3%, higher than other groups. That may very well be the case. There are going to be people and groups left behind in any economy. What we try to do here is we do share the breakouts, but also we want people to keep in mind the overall theme is this a strong economy? Yes, it is. Why is it a strong economy? Here are the numbers. And that doesn't mean that some groups won't be left behind or some people are suffering. It just means that overall, this is a much better economy, for example, than 2019, which was considered the greatest economy ever by Trump. And we can show you measure after measure that shows that it's better now.
Can I say that what was said about black unemployment being higher because of education, I have to push back on that very strongly, because that's just not necessarily the case. Part of it is there are Black citizens being passed over for low-skilled jobs because there are employers that want to violate labor laws and hire undocumented people to pay them a lower wage. They don't want to pay a Black citizen $15 an hour or whatever if they can pay someone, undocumented, more likely to be subjected to exploitation.
No, and and just to be clear here, when you look at let's take a look here at where you see the Latino, white, and Asian unemployment. You see the numbers get lower as educational attainment gets higher, right? But you don't see that with the Black or African American, where 28% higher educational attainment than Latino, but higher unemployment, meaning I'm agreeing with you, Joy, that education is not explaining why African Americans have higher unemployment, because they have better educational attainment than, for example, Latinos. So I agree with you. I don't know why that's an outlier, and we need to dig into that a little more.
Racism
So,
could be a factor.
sure.
Just surprised it wasn't said.
Absolutely. Oh, I totally.
And say, hey, maybe persistent and systemic racism and persistent discrimination still has something, is a factor. That's what I wish was just mentioned. I'm not saying that all of it is racism, but it's definitely a factor, because I don't know if you have a slide talking about wealth, but Black wealth is still pitiful. And at the bottom, it's like our unemployment is highest and our wealth is at the bottom. There's still wage disparities in which we're still making less than white people, and women are making less than men. So I don't know if we have that gender thing in there too, but I would like that included.
No, you're right. And what we can do is we can go through that in our next month. We'll put some more analysis in there. I threw this in because I saw your email come through and I added this. We do that from time to time. We show the different groups, the racial groups, and how they fare. You're right about all those things. I mean, when you look at the net worth of a white family versus a Black family, there's a giant discrepancy. It's enormous. And I remember looking back a few years to bridge that gap. This don't quote me on this, but I'll bring this up again when we get back into it next month. When you compare that, if to bridge that gap, in other words, to bring the average Black family to where the white family is, would be about the equivalent of the Trump tax cuts over 10 years. Meaning, if you diverted that all to the Black families, sort of as reparations, if you will, that would bring the amount almost even. It just happens to be about 3.5 trillion or 4 trillion, and I did that a couple of years ago. So it's a big number, but it's about the same as the Trump tax cuts. It's funny that it works out that way. So I saw a hand raised, Marsha Brown.
Yeah, hi. Just quickly, was there a breakout for the disabled workers?
We
people
didn't
with disabilities?
We can do that in our next one. We can certainly include disabled and other groups in our next monthly session. I'll take a note for that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no doubt there's a ton of discrimination out there in the workforce, not just on almost every basis, whether it's race, age, disabled versus not. I mean, there's going to be a ton of it.
I also see a lot of comments about how, we talk about how this is a good economy that Biden is handing off, but there are still people that don't have health insurance. There's still people that don't own homes. There's still people that are struggling. But the fact of the matter is, there have always been people who did not own homes, who did not have health insurance, who are struggling.
And those things have gotten better. The home ownership rate was higher. I'll show you later. The home ownership rate is higher in 2023 than it was in 2019 and in 2024. And also what's the other one?
People don't have health insurance?
Yeah, and then Biden has the record for the lowest percent uninsured right now. So this is the best that we've ever been at it, and like data going back into the 90s. So yeah, there are people behind, but I think we can argue that point. There's a mention here that many people are struggling, didn't like being told the economy is fine. Maybe they don't, but what happens is then the vast majority of people for who the economy is doing well don't realize it, or they're listening to propaganda and they don't understand just how good things are. They want the leader, the commander in chief has to be the communicator in chief. And toward those 2 years, 2018, 2019, Trump was saying greatest economy ever, over and over and over again, and people believed it. It's part of his brand. And that's something the Democrats need to learn. We just have to, there's going to be some people left behind. That's the way it is. Be sensitive to that. But make sure everybody knows when you're creating economic records that it's in their brain. We got another question. Tamara Brown raising her hand. You're still muted, Tamara. If you want to speak, unmute.
Yeah, sorry, David.
Oh, it's okay.
I had a little feedback. Thank you for this discussion. I think it's been very informative so far. The thing I would mention, someone asked about underinsured or not insured. And then, of course, those still not able to, say, purchase a home. I think a lot of this, and my thought is this, working in policy for most of my career, is there's been an overwhelming bias between people who can afford a home or who choose not to buy a home and rent, right? Or maybe those in the other third side of the pie chart who really would like to buy a home but can't afford it. And I think from the Democrat messaging, there's been an imbalance there because not everybody is in the same page with regard to their needs, but you want to make sure that you have the programs available for people who want to purchase a home or a condominium, et cetera. Same thing with the ACA program. So one of the things that I've run into, I've mentioned this in some discussions, is there's lack of general knowledge about what is available to the public to access to allow them to grow and to empower them. And hopefully going forward in these next few months and years, we can make sure that we reach out to people so they can understand how to become part of the ACA link, health exchange, or get insurance, or if they really are a veteran, how they can access a VA loan to get a home, et cetera. I still think there's a lot of disinformation out there and not enough information for the general public to hopefully take steps, to empower themselves. Thanks.
No, that's fair comment. I'm sure we can do better on all those things. We'll talk about housing in a little bit. So let me try to restrict this to labor for now. We'll come back to it. So let's keep moving, Carl, into the next section. And if there are some more questions later, we'll come back for them.
Okay. So the next section is deficits and debt. And what we see in the fine print here is that fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th. So fiscal year 2025 actually began October 1st of 2024, and President Trump took office 4 months into fiscal year 2025. And so we count fiscal year 2025 as a Biden year because the budgeting was basically done when Biden was president. And there will be some changes to it between now and the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. But by and large, it's a done deal. Obviously, the federal deficit is the difference between tax collections, revenue, and spending, where revenue minus spending would be a surplus, which we haven't had very many of, or when spending exceeds revenue, we had deficits, which is what we had for most of the last 50 plus years. The years where we had surpluses were the end of the Clinton years, and then in 1969, under President Johnson, was a surplus year. The debt is roughly the sum of all the deficits over our history. We last had surpluses in Clinton's second term, and then in 69 under Johnson. And the part of the debt that matters most is the debt that's held by the public, which is Treasury securities that are held by investors, which is 8.3 million in the third quarter of 2024. And it's customary to analyze spending, deficits, and debt, et cetera, relative to the size of the economy or percent of GDP. So the fiscal year 2023 deficit was 1.7 trillion or 6.2% of GDP versus 1.8 trillion or 6.4% of GDP.
We should say 2024. That last one should say FY 2024.
I was going to say that looks wrong. And debt held by the public was 96.4% of GDP in the third quarter of 2024. Typically, the CBO will publish the budget and economic outlook in January and do an August update. And they did actually do a budget and economic outlook. Was it last week? This week? Sometime within the last week. And I don't think we're, I'll be surprised, but I don't think we're putting too much of that into this report because it's just, we'll catch up with that as we move forward. Looking at revenues and sources of revenues, we see that individual income taxes is the largest source of revenues, but payroll taxes are a fairly significant source. And so when you hear about the fact that 46% of the country doesn't pay individual income taxes, it's not that they don't pay taxes, because most of those pay payroll taxes, or they're retired and they paid taxes throughout their lifetime. And the other taxes are as we talked about, excise taxes, tariffs. So Trump wants to go ahead and greatly increase this bottom right box for tariffs. At least he campaigned on that promise. There seems to be some question as to whether or not he's actually going to implement those tariffs now that he's in office. He's getting some pushback from people who say tariffs will raise prices, and that's not a good thing. And you're basically taxing lower income people who are buying goods and services. Now, if we go to where are we spending money, big block is healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security is another big block. Other discretionary, defense. Interest has become a very big block as interest rates have gone from almost 0% up to, what are we paying, about 5% on interest these days at the federal government level. But much of the government spending is politically or legally untouchable. Defense is more politically untouchable than legally untouchable, but things like interest, we sort of legally untouchable. We have to pay interest. Elon Musk and Vivek, I forget his name, that was going to go ahead and cut $2 trillion out of this $6.7 trillion in spending every year. Just a question as to where they're going to find it. But it appears that a lot of what they're planning to hit is support for low-income people, SNAP benefits, other benefits for low-income people, Medicaid, etc. Okay, if we look at the federal revenues and outlays, we see that outlays have tended to exceed revenues. Now, one of the interesting things, if you go back a number of years, you'll see that our Republican friends have told us that, well, you know, revenues at 17% was perfectly adequate, and now they're not. And so what we have is, what they weren't taking into account was the fact that the population is aging, and we get more people who are collecting Social Security, Medicare. Another big factor for old people spending is Medicaid for senior citizens. And as the population ages, outlays were going to go up percentage of GDP, and our Republican friends never took that into account. And so they still don't want to do that. They still want to say, hey, historically 17% was fine. We don't have to pay for the senior citizens or whatever. Now I see a long-term budget challenge, and this is where we see it. Outlays are going to go ahead and increase as a percentage of GDP going forward. And this is because, as I talked about, we've got an aging population, more people being eligible for Social Security, Medicare, and senior citizen Medicaid. If you have to go into a nursing home and you don't have assets and you spend down all your assets, Medicaid will pay for some minimal level of a nursing home care for senior citizens. Now, if we look at what's happening with cost growth, it's the major healthcare programs and Social Security that are the big things that are going to go up. Mainly, it's the healthcare programs, some increase in the Social Security over the next 30 years, but the big increase is going to be in the healthcare programs. And if we look at how much new debt got approved in the two administrations, and we look at the non-COVID and the COVID, under Trump, we had a total of $8.4 trillion, of which $4.8 trillion was non-COVID and $3.6 trillion was COVID. The CARES Act and then the December 2020 checks were under Biden. We had non-COVID of 2.2 and COVID of 2.2 from his American Rescue.
I can cover this one, Carl.
Oh, I think we'll let you do that.
It's not as bad as it looks. You'll hear people screaming a lot about the national debt and how big it is, as if that number alone is meaningful. Again, large numbers by themselves are rarely meaningful. You got to put them in context. But when people talk about which president did better or worse on the deficit and debt, they'll sometimes talk about how much debt was added under that president. That's one way to do it. They can look at what Carl just talked about, was how much their policies affected that debt trajectory, how much they added to that debt. What this one says is, when every president comes into office, there's a projection of how much the debt will be added or what deficits will be every year. This is what the Congressional Budget Office does. It's a 10-year forecast. They do that right at the beginning of every presidency. Every year they do it. And you can compare that to what actually happened. And so this just shows the dotted line is what was forecast by the Congressional Budget Office, and the red line is what actually happened during the fiscal years of that presidency. And you can see the Republicans added a lot more than the Democrats using this measure. For various reasons. In some cases, something happened in the economy. In some cases, it was the tax cuts that the Republicans added. But in general, both Obama and Biden had much lower additions to. They did only slightly worse, or they did worse than the projection, but much less worse than Bush and Trump did. And so you've got the big gaps on the left side and the much smaller gaps on the right side. And, these numbers have changed a little bit. We'll have to update them eventually, but these basically tell the story. The numbers aren't going to change materially for these presidents. The big one that's kind of confusing is Bush 43 in the upper left corner, where he actually inherited a surplus trajectory from Clinton. People don't factor into their analysis when they say, well, Bush didn't add that much to the debt. Well, he sure added an awful lot compared to what was expected when he showed up, and for good and bad reasons. So that's part of what this slide shows you, is just that's the other way. So you've got the actual dollar amount, which is the least useful. You've got this one, which shows what the policies added, which I think is a really good way to explain it. It's very simple. And then a technical way to explain it, which is what was projected, what trajectory did they inherit, and then what actually happened. And I think you know these myths as well as I do, Carl, so I'll hand it back to you unless you want me to continue.
Oh, why don't you take them and I'll just comment, but yeah.
Okay, so you'll hear two very famous myths from Republicans. One is we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem, right? That's one of their main talking points. They've used it for years. It's a meaningless talking point. Revenue and spending are equal parts of the arithmetic of a deficit. There is no rule that says you can't get more revenue, and there's, it's just an invalid, it's a nonsensical phrase. And then the second one is the tax cuts pay for themselves, is another popular one that they've been using for a long time. And the fact is, almost every study of this, from economists of all stripes, government, non-government, says that if you do a tax cut, the deficits are going to go up. They don't pay for themselves. In fact, they barely, if they add to growth, which they do a little bit, that doesn't pay back enough. $1 in tax cuts is going to cost the Treasury about 90 cents to $1. It's not going to pay for itself anywhere close. But what you have to watch out for is people that'll say, well, the revenue went up, though, after the Trump tax cuts. And yes, that's typical. The revenue goes up with the size of the economy. The question, that's the wrong question. The right question is, what would revenue be in the absence of the cuts? That's the right way to think about it. And so that's what CBO tells us. And they tell us, here's how much more revenue you would have if you didn't do those cuts. Basically, revenue would be more as a percent of GDP. And so you would be collecting even more revenue. And CBO does all that, and I'll show you a slide in a minute that shares that. But understand the context that this happens is Republicans are a party that exists to cut taxes for the rich and corporations. That's what they are. And what they do is then they gather their coalition partners. So they, on social issues, they say we're pro-choice, or they say they suddenly find religion, or they're anti-abortion, or whatever their flavor is, to get a bigger coalition so that they can get the tax cuts. This is why the party exists. And so they make up these lies and they hope that people swallow them, and a lot of people do. And it's not complicated to explain it. I mean, both of these myths are silly on their face and nobody should believe them, but an enormous number of people do. And the top part of it also says, when they try to scare you with a debt number, just keep in mind that debt does not exist in a vacuum. If there's a debt, there must be an asset. And the asset are those government bonds that mutual funds own. Many of you own bond funds in your 401ks or in your private savings. And that's where the bonds are. And they're owned by banks and many others. They're owned by individuals. And, they are treasury securities so there are assets that go with the liabilities. And then if you get people, sometimes will say it's not fair for the baby boomers to pass their debt to younger generation, that's a ridiculous statement also, because if the debt is passing, so must the assets. You can't just pass the debt and not the assets. It doesn't make any sense. They must go together. So don't buy those arguments either. There's a lot of nonsense around the deficit, mainly designed, it's mostly noise to get people confused about the Republican agenda, which is they cut taxes for rich people. That's what they do. And if you vote for them, that's what they're going to do. Here is the example for the Trump tax cuts. If they are extended, that will add about $5 trillion to deficits over the next decade, relative to if they don't. So the blue line is the size of the deficits if you let the Trump tax cuts expire, and the orange line is the deficits if those tax cuts get extended. And so this is the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, the most credible source of information. They advise the Congress on all things policy, deficits, debt, and economy. They are nonpartisan. They're run by a Republican currently, and that's what they do. This is what they say. So it's do you want to add $5 trillion to the debt or deficits? And that's what Trump is going to do, if he can, and that's what Republicans do. I guarantee you they are going to extend the Trump tax cuts. They will find a way. If you're losing sleep about the deficit or the debt, the national debt, that part that matters, the debt held by the public, is about $28 trillion, but the net worth of American households is $160 trillion. So we're not going bankrupt anytime soon. Nobody needs to lose sleep thinking, oh no, we're going bankrupt. No, we're not. And it's simply, and the top 10% has $107 trillion of that net worth. The bottom 50% has almost none of it. And if you need to, if there's a debt emergency, there's $100 trillion sitting there to cover the deficit, to pay the interest, or to pay this number down. And as I mentioned earlier, these assets, this red is part of this 100, and mostly in this bucket here. Some of it's certainly in that 50th to 90th. The $28 trillion in Treasury securities is spread out in the net worth of the American people. So don't lose sleep over deficits and debt. You should not. The Republicans try to scare you about it mainly because they want you to cut the taxes. They want you to think there's a spending problem, not a revenue problem, because they are protecting that top 10%. They don't want them to pay more in taxes, but they've got all the money. So, don't believe what you're hearing. Let's pause there. We usually take a break around 8.